Today I would be explaining a horror mystery thriller titled Get Out. Spoilers ahead, keep an eye out. The film starts with a black guy named Dre walking alone at night on a suburban street that's meticulously maintained. Suddenly, a small sports car pulls up beside him and begins slowly following him. Andre becomes frightened and changes direction, walking quickly back the way he came. When he turns around to see what the car is doing, he notices that it's parked where it was before, but the door is open. Out of nowhere, a man wearing a helmet attacks and strangles Dre before dragging his body to the car. Rose arrives at her boyfriend Chris's apartment with coffee and pastries, as they're planning to spend the weekend visiting her family. Chris expresses concern that her family doesn't know that he's black. However, Rose assures him that her family is progressive and that while they may say some insensitive things, he has nothing to worry about. During the car ride to Rose's parents' house, Chris goes for a cigarette, but Rose takes it away from him and throws it out of the window. She tells him that her parents disapprove of smoking. Chris calls his friend Rod, who works as a TSA agent, and asks him to take care of his dog and avoid feeding him human food. Rod teases him about visiting white folk and warns him against it. He also flirts with Rose, making Chris a bit jealous, but Rose finds it endearing. While they're engrossed in conversation, a deer suddenly appears and gets hit by their car. They pull over to investigate and call the police. The police show up and ask what they're doing in the area. Rose tells them that they're visiting her family. The officer asks to see Chris's ID, but Rose steps in and says that because he wasn't driving there's no need for that. The officer lets them go, and Chris tells Rose that was hot. Chris and Rose arrive at her parents' home. Her dad, Dean Armitage, is an affable neurosurgeon and her mom, Missy, is a strangely cold hypnotherapist. Dean gives Chris a tour of the house and shows him old family photos. There are also pictures of Rose's brother who will be joining them later. He's a surgeon like his dad, but he went through a rough patch. The conversation between the parents and Chris is a little off. They inquire if Chris smokes, to which he attests. Missy offers to cure Chris of his nicotine addiction through hypnosis, but he doesn't feel cool with people tooling around in his head. The family also has two on-site black helpers. There's Walter the groundskeeper and Georgina the maid. Dean acknowledges that it looks bad. Two wealthy white people have two helpers who are black, but they were hired to take care of his parents, and Dean would have felt bad letting them go. There's something off about both Walter and Georgina. They have a definite stiff step-forward artificial politeness about them. They also both speak using dated vernacular. Missy asks about Chris's parents. His dad left when he was young and his mom was hit by a car when he was 11. Georgina sort of short-circuits while pouring tea and Missy tells her to go lay down and get some rest. The Armitages tell Rose that they're having their big party tomorrow. She's surprised and they remind her that it's the same day every year. Rose's brother Jeremy arrives. He's an aggressively dickish rich kid. That night the family has dinner as drunken Jeremy starts talking to Chris about MMA fighting. He says that because Chris comes from a hardy stock he'd be a natural. The teasing goes on as Dean and Missy tell Jeremy that it's time for him to go to bed as he leaves. Chris and Rose retire to their room where she apologizes for her family's weird behavior, and they go to sleep. In the middle of the night, Chris gets up and decides to sneak out for a cigarette. While outside he sees something in the distance charging towards him. It's Walter! He heads straight for Chris, but makes a sharp turn at the last moment, and runs off in another direction. Inside the house, Georgina is staring out a window. It turns out she's looking at her reflection, not Chris. She adjusts her hair and Chris decides to head back inside. Before Chris can make it back to his room, Missy turns on a light and startles him. She tells him that smoking is a bad habit and offers again to help. He sits down and mocks the notion of hypnotism, unaware of the fact that she's slowly hypnotizing him while using her teaspoon as a focus object. She takes him back to when he was 11 on the night his mom died. She didn't come home from work and he was too scared to do anything about it. He was afraid that if he called the police, it would make it real. So he just sat there watching television, nervously digging his nails into his bedposts. Chris is currently doing the same thing, digging his nails into the arms of the chair. She tells him to sink, and 11-year-old Chris sinks into his bed, while present-day Chris sinks into blackness, seeing himself and Missy far above. His consciousness has left his body, while his body is still paralyzed in his chair. He wakes in the morning and checks his phone. Rod has sent Chris a picture of him pretending to give his dog beer. His battery is low, so he plugs it in. Chris tells Rose that he thinks maybe her mom hypnotized him last night. He has vague recollections of the evening. The Armitages' wealthy friends start to show up for the big party. It's mostly older white people who say a lot of inappropriate things to Chris, like how he has a good build. Because Tiger Woods golfs, he must have a good swing too, and our black guys better in bed. Chris sneaks off and finds a blind man named Jim Hudson who says that all the people at the party are ignorant. He's an art dealer, and Chris is well aware of who he is. Jim says that he's a fan of Chris's work. He recognizes the irony of a blind art dealer but tells him that he has a really good assistant who is great at describing pieces. He envies Chris's eye. He tried photography but was never very good at it. Chris goes back to mingling with the guests and discovers another black guy. It's a young guy about his age. Chris tries to bond with him, who introduces himself as Logan, the husband of a white woman clearly way older than him. But he too is stiff and unnatural like Walter and Georgina. There's something about him that seems familiar to Chris though. Chris decides to check in with Rod again. When he returns to his phone, he finds it unplugged again. He plugs it in and calls Rod to tell him everything that's been going on. Rod tells him that white people love to have sex slaves and he needs to get out of there. Rose finds Chris and he tells her how weird everything is and that his phone was unplugged again. She tells him he's just being paranoid because he's in an uncomfortable situation. He agrees and she leaves. Rod tells Chris to take a picture of the black guy and he'll see if he remembers him. As Chris is about to leave, he's blocked by Georgina, who apologizes for unplugging his cellular phone. He says that it's fine and hopes that he didn't mean to snitch on her. She doesn't understand. So he clarifies as she responds with showing she understands now. She gets super weird and keeps walking closer to him and lets out a single tear while telling him that the Armitages treat her like family. She turns and quickly leaves. Chris goes back outside and tries to discreetly take the familiar black man's picture with his cell phone, but has forgotten to turn off the flash. As soon as his phone flashes, he freezes. His nose starts bleeding and he jumps at Chris, telling him to get out while he still can. Rose is freaked out now too. She inquires what happened as Dean explains that the flash just caused the man to have a seizure. He comes out and apologizes for upsetting everyone and says he must return home. Chris and Rose go for a walk and Chris tells her that he is sure he recognizes the guy and that something strange is definitely going on. She agrees, and how he would never abandon her. Chris says that he'd really like to go home now. Rose reluctantly agrees. She says she'll make up something to tell her parents. Back at the house, a strange quiet bingo game is going on. Dean holds up a number on his fingers and some of the guests hold up cards that show bingos on them already. It is revealed that Dean is holding an auction with his guests, and next to him is a framed picture of Chris. Jim Hudson wins the auction. The rest of the guests all go home. Chris goes back to pack his belongings and gets a call from Rod, who tells him that the guy in the picture is a guy they knew named Dre but went missing. His phone battery dies. Chris notices the closet door is open. He looks inside and finds a box filled with photos of Rose posed romantically with many other black guys, including Walter and Georgina, who don't look at all like the robotic versions of themselves. Chris isn't the first black guy Rose has been with after all. Rose returns and Chris says that he needs the keys to put their bags in the car. She looks for them in her purse as they make their way out of the house. Jeremy blocks the door. Dean and Missy are there too. Jeremy is ready to attack, but Missy and Dean tell him to calm down. Chris keeps telling Rose to get the keys and she's looking. Chris yells at Rose to find the keys again and Rose stops looking scared, looks calm, and looks up and says she can't give him the keys as she shows them to him. She's in on whatever this is. Jeremy attacks. Dean yells and Missy clinks his teaspoon on her glass, causing Chris to sink back into the dark void again. As he sinks back into the void, they take him to the basement. As he is being moved, Rose tells Chris that he was one of her favorites. Rod keeps trying to call Chris but it's not going through. He looks up at the picture of the guy in the photo and sees that he went missing some time ago, so he goes to the police. He tells a female officer that his boy was kidnapped by white folk to be a sex slave just like the missing guy in the picture. She calls in 2 more officers to listen to Rod's story. When he finishes, they all burst out laughing. No one takes him seriously. Chris wakes to find himself tied to a chair in front of a mounted deer head and an old TV. He watches a video made by Dean's father that talks about immortality. Chris sees that his fingernails have clawed through the leather arm of the chair and exposed the padding. The teacup and spoon appear on the screen again as it clinks, and he passes out. Rod tries Chris's phone again, and Rose answers. She says that Chris left 2 days ago and is concerned too. He left in a taxi or an Uber maybe. Rod tells her that he went to the police, and she seems concerned about this. He starts to realize that something is wrong, so he tries to record the call. When he goes back to talking to her, she tells him she knows that he has the hots for her. He tells her she is crazy and hangs up. Chris wakes up and Jim Hudson is on the screen. He tells Chris that they're going to swap brains and what he really wants is to be able to see the world through Chris's eyes. Dean has perfected neurosurgery to make this all possible. And Missy hypnotizes the body donors to prep them for the procedure. He'll continue existing in the dark void, but will be able to continue on as sort of a passenger. The flashing is an unfortunate side effect as they saw earlier at the party. The teaspoon clinks and Chris is out again. Dean and Jeremy prep Jim Hudson for a brain transplant. Jeremy goes to get Chris. As he reaches the basement, he finds Chris unconscious. He takes off his restraints and gets in for ready. Chris wasn't unconscious after all. He stuffed the padding from the chair in his ears to block the sound of the teaspoon. He knocks out Jeremy. Dean starts calling for Jeremy and goes out of the lab area to check on him. Chris rushes him and impales him with the deer antlers from the other room. He knocks over a candle that ignites the blanket covering Jim Hudson too. Rose has earbuds in and isn't aware any of this is going on. She is listening to music while looking up NCAA prospects on the internet. Chris goes upstairs and finds Missy. She goes for the teacup and spoon, but Chris beats her to them and smashes them. Instead, she attacks him with a knife, but he turns it on her and stabs her. Chris goes for the front door again, but Jeremy has returned and puts him in a chokehold. Chris breaks free and kills Jeremy too. He runs outside and gets in Jeremy's car. On the passenger seat is the helmet from earlier. He starts to drive off but hits Georgina. He can't just let her lay there as his mom did, so he gets her in the car and continues down the driveway. Rose whispers, "Grandma," and runs down the steps of the now burning house with the shotgun. This is when you realize that Georgina has the grandmother's brain. She wakes up and attacks him. She's yelling that he has destroyed the family. They crash into a tree and she dies. Rose is coming after him with a gun. From out of nowhere, Walter runs and tackles Chris with Rose saying, "Get him, Grandpa." During the struggle, Chris grabs his phone and takes a picture that flashes. Walter gets up with his nose bleeding and turns to Rose and collects the gun. Obviously, this is Rose's grandfather's brain in Walter because she hands him the shotgun, but he shoots Rose in the stomach. Then turns it on himself and kills himself. Chris is slowly getting up hurt from the car crash and the attack from Walter. He sees that Rose is still alive and is trying to get the gun. He moves the gun and crawls over on top of her and begins to choke her. She starts saying, "I love you," while being choked and starts to grin because he is getting too upset to go through with it. Then the police lights appear on the road. Chris gets off of her and puts his hands up. Rose starts weakly calling out help. The car door opens and is revealed to be a TSA patrol car and Rod in it. Chris gets in the car and Rose finally succumbs to her wounds. After a moment of silence, Rod tells him that he should not have gone to the house. They drive off with Chris staring out into the darkness and feeling lucky. The end. Please like and subscribe to Pro Recap and also turn on the notification bell if you enjoy more videos like this. See you next time.